12 chairs scraped back at once, and the old man stopped halfway to the door. Nobody had said a word. I was 3 steps behind him with his coffee still in my hand. The men at the long table by the window were standing. Not fast, not angry. Straight up, all 12 of them, saluting him like they had rehearsed it for years. He didn't turn around. His shoulder came up a little, the way you flinch before a door slams, and his hand went into his coat pocket and closed on something folded soft with age. He had been coming to us one day a year for as long as anyone could remember. Same booth, meatloaf, and black coffee. 11 years, and he never told me why. Our new manager had spent about 4 minutes deciding the old man was bad for the room, and the old man had left rather than argue. Now the manager was asking what this was supposed to mean, and nobody was answering him. Then one of the 12 lowered his hand. "Sir," he said, "that booth was never just a booth." The old man turned. His face wasn't proud. It was the face people make at gravesides. And the oldest of them said, "We've been waiting 3 years for him to come back. My name is Dana Whitlock. I've waited tables at Lindstrom's on 3rd Street in Ashfield, Ohio for 11 years, and before that I sat the night audit desk at the Ashfield Inn for 9. That job marks a person. You spend a few thousand nights matching what the day claimed happened against what the ledger says happened, and afterward you can't walk past a line that doesn't add up. It isn't a talent. It's closer to an itch. So let me be honest at the front end of this. I noticed everything about that man for 11 years and I understood none of it. He came the first Friday of March. Not the first week, not around the first of the month. The first Friday. And I think if you'd handed him a calendar, he could have named the date for the next 10 years without moving his lips. Gray topcoat that had been a good coat once. A Buick, the color of dishwater, parked in the far corner of the lot, nose out, every single time. He asked for booth 7. Always the same way, hat already off. Is 7 open? 7 is the back corner foretop by the window, which is the worst table in the house for a party of 1 and the best table in the house for a man who would rather not be looked at. Meatloaf and black coffee. He ate about half of it. He drank all the coffee and then held the empty cup a while, like there was still something in it worth waiting on. And before he sat down every year, he'd put his right hand under the lip of the table and run his thumb along the underside of the edge. Back and forth, twice, the way you check a shelf for splinters. I watched him do that 11 times. I never asked him about it once. Of everything I got wrong, that's the piece I'd take back first. The other thing was the paper. Somewhere between the coffee and the food, he'd take a folded square out of his inside pocket and open it flat on the table, and he'd read it the way you read a road sign you already know by heart. Then he'd fold it back along creases so old the paper had gone soft and furry at the edges. He never hid it from me. When I came with the pot, he'd just rest his hand on it, flat, and wait for me to finish pouring. 6 years back, the kitchen ran out of meatloaf. It happens. Friday special. Big table of 11 came in at 5:30 and took the last of the pan, and at 6 o'clock I had an old man in booth 7 and nothing to bring him. I told him and he said that was fine, he'd have the coffee, and he sat there with his hands around that cup and something went out of his face. Not anger. He went somewhere. Marla, who cooked for us then, saw me standing at the pass with my order pad and no order, and she asked what was wrong with me, and I said, I need 1 meatloaf and I don't care where it comes from. She thawed a portion from the walk-in and pan-fried it and put gravy over the top of it, and it was not our best work. He ate about half, which is what he ate of the good ones. When I cleared the plate, he said thank you twice. I told that story for years as an example of how particular old people get about their food. I called him Mr. Alcott, because that's what the credit slip said the one year he didn't have cash. Raymond Alcott. That was the whole of what I knew about him, and it took me 9 years to learn it. Here's the part that should have told me something. We keep a book, not a screen. A black ledger the owners never got around to replacing, and in the back of it, on a page that's been photocopied and photocopied again, there's a standing hold. First Friday of March, booth 7, 6 p.m. It's written in a slanted hand with a fountain pen, and the ink has gone the brown that old ink goes. Arvid Lindstrom opened this restaurant in 1954. The handwriting isn't his. I've looked at his signature on the license frame by the register 100 times. Whoever wrote that line stopped working here before I was born, and not one person I ever asked could tell me who it was. What they could all tell me was the rule. You don't seat booth 7 that night. Not for a 2-top. Not for a family of 6 standing in the doorway in the rain with a kid crying. You leave it, and if the boss asks, you say it's held. I asked Rosalie, who'd been here 26 years, why. She said, "Because it's held, honey." That was the entire explanation available in Ashfield, Ohio. There was one more thing I logged and filed and never added up, and it's the one that eats at me now. On that same night, every year, table 12 filled with men. Table 12 is the long one on the other side of the dining room, under the window, 10 feet from the front door, and about as far from booth 7 as you can get and still be in the same building. They never called ahead. They came in around 6, 1 and 2 at a time, and they filled the seats, and they were the easiest party I ever waited on. They ordered simple, paid separately, tipped like they'd talked about it in the parking lot, and left before he did. Every year. Before he did. I thought they were a church group. I thought they were a hunting club, a union local, some kind of Elks thing. I had 11 years of evidence sitting 10 feet from the front door, and I filed it under men who like coffee. Then 3 years ago he didn't come. I held the booth, 6 o'clock, 7, 8:30. I turned away a couple who wanted the window for an anniversary, and I gave them dessert on me to make up for it. At close, I wiped down a table nobody had eaten at. The next March I held it again and felt like a fool doing it. The year after that I held it and didn't feel much of anything. I decided he was dead. That's what I said to myself at 10 after 9 with a rag in my hand. He's dead, Dana. People die. You never even learned where he lived. And table 12 came anyway. All 3 of those years. Same night, same seats, and they stayed later than they used to, and when they left they looked at booth 7 on their way out the door. I noticed that too. I want credit for noticing and I don't deserve any, because I still didn't ask. This past March, the first Friday landed on the 6th. It rained most of the afternoon and quit around 5. He came through the door at 6 on the dot, with a cane he hadn't had before and a left side that moved a half beat behind the right. And the man standing behind the register, 8 weeks into the job, had never heard of any of it. Brightline Hospitality bought Lindstrom's in November, 6 restaurants across 2 states, a website with a photograph of a farm on it. They kept the name because the name was the only thing about us worth anything. Dale Merrick came in January. 33 years old, general manager, transferred up from a chain steakhouse outside Dayton. I'm going to be fair to him because I've had 5 months to stop being angry, and I've only made it about halfway. He was not a cruel man. He was a scared one with a laminated card. The card said guest experience standards, and he carried it in his shirt pocket and he actually referred to it, which I'd never seen a grown person do. He repainted the entryway a color called Harvest Linen. He changed the coffee to a blend that cost more and tasted like a magazine. He took the pie case off the counter because it blocked sightlines, and when Rosalie asked where people were supposed to see the pie now, he said the menu, and Rosalie laughed so hard she had to sit down in the office. He also worked 90 hours a week. I know for a fact he slept in his car in our lot twice in February, because I opened both mornings and his windows were fogged. Brightline had given him numbers to hit and 8 months to hit them, and I think he understood, correctly, that if he missed them, nobody at that company would ever say his name again. I'd applied for his job. I want that on the record too, since it's the kind of thing that would come out eventually. I'd been floor-led 4 years. I'd trained everybody on that schedule, and they flew a kid up from Dayton. So when I say I didn't like him, take about 20% off for that. He'd never worked a first Friday in March. Nobody told him. I want to be careful here because that's the excuse I keep handing him and it's only half true. Nobody told him about the booth, and that's on us. But he'd been standing at that register for 8 weeks watching me hold a 4-top open on a Friday, and he never asked me one question about it either. At 6:04 he came up beside me at the service station while I was cutting lemons. "Who's the gentleman in the corner?" "That's Mr. Alcott." "He a regular?" "Once a year." Merrick did the thing he did when an answer didn't fit in a box, which was to blink twice and move on. "He's on a 4-top. "He is." "On a Friday." "He's been sitting there since before this building had air conditioning." That should have been enough. It wasn't a lie and it wasn't an argument, and if he'd let it go, I'd have gone back to the lemons and none of the rest of it would have happened. But he watched him. That's the part I didn't expect. Merrick stood at that station a full 2 minutes with his arms folded, watching an old man in a gray coat try to get his coffee cup to his mouth with a hand that shook, and I could see him doing arithmetic behind his eyes, and I want to tell you the arithmetic wasn't all about the seat. "Is he all right?" he said. "He's unsteady. He had something happen. He's slower than he was." Is he here with somebody? No. Dana. He lowered his voice like we were conspiring. I've got a guest at a four-top who's swaying in his seat, alone, and a dining room filling up. If he goes down, that's on me. Move him to the counter. He'll be closer to the kitchen, he'll be closer to help, do it kindly. And I heard the kindly. I want to be honest about that too. He said do it kindly and he meant it, the way people mean a thing when meaning it costs them nothing. I said, I can't move him. You can't. Not out of that booth. Not tonight. He waited for the reason. I stood there with a knife in my hand and I did not have one. 11 years, and everything I had was Rosalie's answer. Because it's held, honey. I could hear how it would sound coming out of my mouth in front of a man with a laminated card, and I chose not to sound like that in front of him, and I have thought about that choice every single night since. I'll handle it, he said. There were 7 open tables. I counted them while he crossed the dining room, because that's what I do, and the number sat wrong in me the way a number does. There was no wait. There was no wait at all. He crouched down beside booth 7 the way they teach you to, at eye level, one hand on the table edge. I was close enough with the pot to hear the whole thing, and there wasn't any shouting in it. That's what I need you to understand. Not one raised voice in the entire event. Sir, how's everything tasting tonight? It's fine. Thank you. I'd love to get you set up at the counter. We've got a wait building, and I've got a nice spot right by the window there. Mr. Alcott looked at the room. He was old and his left side didn't work right, but there was nothing wrong with his eyes, and he counted the same 7 tables I did. He said, I'll just finish my coffee. I can bring it over for you. And listen, dinner's on us tonight. Whole thing. On the house, my pleasure. That was the moment. Not the moving. The on the house. I watched his face change, and I didn't understand what I was watching until much later. He set down his fork. He reached into his coat and brought out his wallet, and he took out bills he'd already folded before he left home, and he laid them on the table and squared them up with 2 fingers. That's not necessary, Merrick said. It is, he said. He didn't argue. He didn't say a word about the booth or the date or the 57 years. He picked up his hat, and he put his hand on the edge of the table to push himself up, and I saw his thumb go under the lip one last time and move, back and forth, twice. Then he started for the door. I was coming after him with the coffee. I don't know what I planned to do with it. Hand it to him in the parking lot, I guess, like that would fix something. And behind me the whole far side of the dining room stood up at once. I've been asked a dozen times since then what it sounded like. And the answer is chairs. 12 chairs on tile. All inside the same half second. And then nothing. I had my back to them. I turned around with a coffee pot in my hand like an idiot. They came up out of that table in a way I can only describe as unhurried. Nobody bumped anybody. The one on the end had to use the table to get himself vertical, and the man next to him waited for him without looking at him, the way you wait for somebody whose pride you know. And then they were standing in a line along the window with their arms at their sides. The oldest of them raised his hand first. He was 70-something, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat and a cap with nothing written on it. He brought his hand up to the edge of his eyebrow and held it there. The rest went up with him inside a second. Some of the hands were steady. Some of them weren't. One of the younger ones, a man maybe 40 with a shaved head, had his jaw locked so hard I could see the muscle move from across the room. And the room went quiet in stages. First our section, then the middle, then the front, and then a booth of teenagers by the door who stopped mid-sentence and never finished it. A busser named Kyle stood in the aisle holding a full tub of dishes and did not set it down for 4 minutes. His arms shook. He didn't set it down. Mr. Alcott stopped with about 8 feet to go to the door. He didn't turn. His shoulder came up. His right hand went into his coat pocket, and I watched his knuckles go white through the skin, and I understood that whatever was in that pocket was the thing he reached for when the ground moved. Dale Merrick came out from behind the register at a fast walk, and to his credit he had figured out that something was happening, and he had no idea what it was. "Gentlemen," he said. Can somebody tell me what this is?" 12 men held a salute and did not answer him. There is no worse thing that can happen to a person than being ignored in his own building by people who are being perfectly polite. The oldest one brought his hand down. He looked past Merrick entirely, at the back of that gray coat. "Sir," he said, "that booth was never just a booth." And Mr. Alcott turned around. "I've had customers cry on me. I've had a man propose at table 4 and a woman find out about her husband at table 9, and I thought I had some idea of the range. His face wasn't in the range. It wasn't grief exactly, and it sure wasn't pride. It was the look of a man who has heard a name spoken out loud that he has only ever said inside his own head, and now has to decide whether to answer to it in front of strangers. The oldest one said, "We've been waiting 3 years for him to come back." Him. Not you. I heard it. I stood there and I heard him say him, and I didn't have anywhere to put it. What I did next was not brave and it wasn't smart. It was the itch. Every eye in that dining room was on those 2 men, and I turned my back on the whole thing and walked to booth 7, and I got down on one knee beside it and put my head under the table edge like I was looking for a dropped fork. The underside of a restaurant table is not a nice place. Gum, staples, 40 years of somebody's initials. 6 inches in from the corner, on the side where he always sat, there was a brass plate. It was small, maybe 2 inches by 3. It was screwed on with 4 flathead screws, and the brass had gone dark everywhere except along the letters, where 50 years of somebody's thumb had kept it bright. I had to get my phone light on it to read it, and my hand wasn't steady, so it took me 2 tries. Lance Corporal Thomas A. Deal, United States Marine Corps, 1947 to 1968. And for the one who came home, this seat is kept. And an inch to the left of the plate, cut into the wood with a knife by somebody in a hurry, deep enough that you could feel it before you saw it. T, D, and R.A. 367. I want to tell you I got up gracefully. I got up like a 44-year-old woman getting up off a tile floor, one hand on the seat back, and I stood there in the corner of my own dining room holding a coffee pot, and I could not make my mouth work. Rosalie was watching me. She'd been at Lindstrom's 26 years. She'd told me because it's held, honey, and she'd meant it. And now she saw my face and she put her hand over her mouth. And I understood that she had never looked under there either. Nobody had. It was 6 inches from where 1,000 people a week set their knees, and it might as well have been buried in a field. 54 years. And the only man who ever touched it thought he was touching a scratch in the wood. Here's what I should have done. I should have walked to the front of that dining room and said it out loud. 20 seconds. 2 sentences, and every person in that building would have understood what they were standing in the middle of. I didn't, because in the same half-minute Mr. Alcott got his face back under control and said, "Thank you. That wasn't necessary," and pushed the door open and walked out into the parking lot. Not fast. He couldn't go fast. He went out at the speed of a man with a cane and a bad left leg, and he never looked back at any of us, and the door swung shut behind him on its slow hinge, and the 12 men at the window stood there with their hands down and let him go. That's the part nobody puts in the version they've heard. Everybody wants the salute. The salute is the good part. But it was a full 10 seconds of nobody moving, and in those 10 seconds it stopped being beautiful and turned into something else. That old man hadn't been honored. He'd been found out, in public. On the one night of the year he'd spent 5 decades making sure nobody looked at him. Merrick turned around and found me standing by booth 7 with my phone light still on. "Dana," he said. His voice had gone thin. "Clock out. Go home. We'll talk tomorrow." And I said, "In a minute. I have a son, Cal, who was 16 that March and eats like a wood chipper, and I had $410 in checking." I mentioned that so you know I heard the man. Clock out meant something in my life. It meant Saturday and Sunday might go away too. And after that the schedule gets quiet in a way you can't argue with. I went out the side door by the dumpsters and around the building, because I didn't want to walk past those 12 men, and I found him in the far corner of the lot with the driver's door open, not getting in. He was standing with one hand on the roof of that Buick, looking at the wet asphalt. "Mr. Alcott, I'm not coming back in." "I know. Then you can go on in yourself. You'll get cold." I had his coffee. I'd carried it out there in a to-go cup, which is the only genuinely useful thing I did all night. I set it on the roof of his car next to his hand, and he looked at it, and something in his shoulders came down about an inch. "He didn't know," I said. "The manager. He's new. He didn't know about the booth. Nobody's supposed to know about the booth." He said it plainly, like he was correcting a fact on a form. That was the point of it. 50 degrees, wet parking lot, sodium lights just coming on. He had rain on his shoulders, and he wasn't in any hurry to get out of it. "Those men in there," I said. "I don't know those men. They know you. People know a lot of things about a person." He picked up the coffee and held it without drinking it. The way he held the empty cup every year. 20 years I've walked past that table. Nobody ever said a word to me. That was fine. That was a good arrangement, and somebody tonight decided to fix it. That was when I found out I was going to tell him. I want to be straight about this, because I've heard people describe what I did as sweet, and it wasn't sweet. I was standing in a parking lot about to hand a 78-year-old man a piece of information that his best friend's family had spent half a century keeping away from him on purpose. I didn't know their reasons. I knew mine, which is that I couldn't let him drive home believing he'd been laughed at. I said, "There's a plate under that table." He didn't move. "Under the edge. On your side, 6 inches in from the corner. It's brass, it's about this big, and it's been there a long time." I heard my own voice go flat and careful, the way it used to go when I had to tell somebody at 2 in the morning that their card had declined. "It has a name on it. Thomas A. Deal. Lance Corporal, Marine Corps. 1947 to 1968. The coffee cup came down onto the roof of the car very slowly and stopped there. "Say the rest of it." "It says, 'And for the one who came home, this seat is kept.'" The sound he made wasn't a word. It was the sound a person makes when they've been holding something up for a long time and somebody takes hold of the other end. He turned around and he leaned back against the car, both hands on the roof behind him, and he stayed like that with his chin down and his eyes shut. I stood there and I did not touch him, because I had a feeling that touching him right then would have been the last straw on him, and after a while he got his breath back. 54 years, he said. "I have been feeling for a scratch in that wood. There's a carving too, right next to it. TD and RA. 367. That I know about." I watched him do it. A short, ugly little laugh, ruined a good knife on it. His mother would have taken his head off. You never found it again. 72, 73, somewhere in there, it wasn't there anymore. I put my hand under and there was nothing but flat. He shook his head slowly. At the asphalt. I figured they refinished the table. Or replaced it. I figured I'd been sitting at the wrong booth for 40 years and had the decency not to check. And then he looked up at me and asked the only question that mattered, and his voice wasn't steady when he asked it. "Who put it there?" I said I didn't know. Behind me the side door of the restaurant opened and shut, and gravel moved, and the oldest man from table 12 came around the corner of the building with his cap in his hands. He stopped a good 10 feet off. He didn't come any closer than that. In the whole rest of the night, he never once came closer than a person can reach. "My mother did," he said. 1972. Arvid Lindstrom let her, and he did the screws himself because she couldn't get the angle. Mr. Alcott looked at him for a long moment. "You're the little one," he said. "I was 12. You were 12 when I shipped. 13 when you came to the house." The old man's mouth moved and nothing came out of it. "Wendell," said the man in the canvas coat. "Wendell Deal. Tommy was my brother." They stood 10 feet apart in a wet parking lot for a while without saying anything, and I stayed where I was because leaving would have made noise. "Why under the table?" Mr. Alcott said finally. "You told her no. I don't remember telling her anything." 69. "You came by the house in February, and she asked you to speak at the dedication at the cemetery, and you said no, and she asked what you'd rather have, and you said." Wendell stopped and started again. "You said, 'I'd rather nobody made a display out of him.'" The old man's head went down. "She took you at your word," Wendell said. "Then in 72 the fire marshal made Arvid replace half the seating and she about lost her mind, because that was the last thing in this town with Tommy's knife in it. So she had a plate made and she asked Arvid to put it where nobody would ever make a display out of it. Under the edge. On your side. She said if it was going to be anywhere it ought to be where a man's hand goes. She never told me. She never told anybody. She told me in the hospital in 99, and she made me swear I'd leave it alone." He turned the cap over in his hands. Her exact words. "Leave him be, Wendell, he's doing the hard part." I heard the door again. The rest of them had come out, not in a group, in ones and twos, and they were standing back by the corner of the building at a distance you'd call respectful if you didn't know what it cost them. Mr. Alcott looked at that line of men. "And who are all of you?" Here's what Wendell told him, and I've since heard it told better and shorter by people who weren't there, so I'll give it the way he actually said it, which was badly, in pieces, with his hands. After Tommy, their mother started having coffee on Thursday mornings at her kitchen table for men who'd come back from over there and couldn't sit still in a church basement. It was not a program. There was no name on it. It was a pot of coffee and a woman who had already had the worst thing happen and was therefore not afraid of anybody's silence. Some weeks it was 2 men. Some weeks it was 9. That went on until she got sick, and then it went on at Wendell's kitchen table, and then it moved to the back room of a hardware store, and by the time it got to be a real thing with a lending fund and a phone number, it had been going for 30-some years and had never once been called anything. We started coming here in 2006, Wendell said. It was Perry's idea. He didn't point. One of the men behind him lifted his chin an inch. He said, "The man keeps that date by himself every year, and we're a group that meets on Thursdays and does nothing on the first Friday in March." So we came, and sat across the room, and sat across the room. 20 years. Wendell's voice finally went. You want to know what the rule was? The rule was, nobody goes over there. You get your coffee, you keep your eyes to yourself, and when he's got his hat on, you're already gone because the man is not doing this for an audience. I have made new fellas swear to it in the parking lot. I made one of them swear to it tonight. 40 minutes before he stood up. Then why did you stand up? Nobody answered that for a second. The man with the shaved head, the one whose jaw I'd watched from across the dining room, said, "Because he was putting you out." That was all he said the entire night. 12 of you, Mr. Alcott said. That's the table number. Wendell almost laughed. That's all it is. Table 12. Then somebody looked it up one year, and Ashfield County lost 12 boys over there, and after that we kept 12 seats whether we had 12 men or not. He shrugged, embarrassed. It's not a code. It's a table. And then he said the thing that finished it. 3 years ago you didn't come. We sat till close. Perry drove past the address I had on you and there was a swing set in the yard. He was working hard to keep it level. The phone was disconnected. I checked the paper for 11 weeks. I checked the county in 3 states. I want you to understand that we sat in that room 3 years running with an empty booth across from us, and we came anyway, because the alternative was deciding it was over, and none of us was willing to be the one who decided that. Mr. Alcott said, quietly, I had a stroke. I figured it was that or the other thing. 2023, in April. Then I broke the hip going after the mail in the winter, and my daughter had me in Columbus 14 months, and by the time I could drive it was July. He shook his head. Every March I sat in her kitchen, and I knew what the date was. I want somebody to write that down somewhere. I knew what the date was. I believe you. 57 years and I missed 3. You didn't miss them, Wendell said. We held them. The old man put his hand in his coat pocket, and this time he brought out what was in it. It was a piece of paper about the size of a playing card, folded in 4, and the folds had gone white and soft. It had been carried in a shirt pocket in a wet country, and then in a coat pocket in Ohio for the better part of 60 years, and it had the shape of that. He held it out toward me. My eyes are no good in this light, he said. And I've never read it out loud. I said, not once? Not once. So I stood under a sodium lamp in the parking lot of the restaurant where I work, and I unfolded another man's letter, and I want you to know my hands were not steady either. The pencil had gone silver. Some of it I had to guess at from the shape of the words. Ray, if you don't eat, I'm writing your mother. Here's the deal. First Friday in March. Lindstrom's, booth 7. Meatloaf and black coffee, same as the last one. If we both get home, you're buying, because you still owe me for the bus. If only one of us gets home, he goes anyway. Every year. And he doesn't get to sit there being sad about it the whole time. That's the whole deal. Eat something. Sign it. T-deal. 9/14/67. And underneath that, in a different hand in pencil pressed hard enough to dent the paper, one line. Raymond Alcott. I stood there and looked at that signature. 19 years old, in a place I can't imagine, signing his name at the bottom of a piece of notebook paper like it was a contract, because a friend of his had decided that was funny and serious at the same time. It wasn't a memorial. That's the thing I had wrong, and the whole town had wrong, and every version of this story I've heard since has had wrong. Nobody had been mourning at booth 7 for 57 years. A 20-year-old had looked at his friend, who had stopped eating and stopped talking sometime after the middle of September, and he had built him one appointment a year that he was not allowed to break. Signed and everything. So there'd be a thing on the calendar. So there'd be a date he had to be alive for. What happened in September, I said. We lost a truck in September. He took the paper back out of my hands, careful, and folded it along its creases without looking at it. That's all I'll say about September. He wrote that the following week. And then January. And then January. He put it back in his pocket and pressed his hand flat over the outside of the coat. So I got the deal. And he got the other thing. And I have been holding up my end since March of '69, Wendell said from 10 feet off. You held it up better than anybody I ever met. I did not. Sharp for the first time all night. Sharper than he'd been with Merrick, sharper than he'd been with me. Read it again. Read the last part of it again. I didn't have to. He doesn't get to sit there being sad about it the whole time. 57 years, Mr. Alcott said. And I have broken that clause every single one of them. Nobody had anything to say to that, and he didn't want anything said to it. He turned and looked at the building. Steam off the kitchen vent, the front windows all lit up, the whole dining room standing around inside not eating their food because of him. That fella in there, he said, the young one with the card in his pocket. Dale, I said. Is he going to fire you? That is the question he asked, standing in a parking lot with a dead man's handwriting in his coat, on the worst night he'd had in 3 years. Whether I was going to lose my shift. Probably not, I said, and I wasn't sure. Then I'd like my coffee at the table, he said. If it still held. I turned around, and Dale Merrick was standing in the side doorway with his arms hanging down. I don't know how long he'd been there. Long enough. He'd come out without a coat and his glasses had steamed and he hadn't wiped them, and he was looking at that old man the way you look at a thing you've put your foot through. He came down the 2 steps and he stopped further away than Wendell had. Sir, he said, I'd like to apologize. All right. I didn't know. No. Merrick waited for something to come back at him and nothing did, and I watched him figure out that he was going to have to stand in it. I've got a card in my pocket, he said. It's got 9 rules on it about guest experience, and there is not one word on it about a table that's held. I've been reading it every day for 8 weeks. You'd want to add a line, Mr. Alcott said. That was it. That was the entire absolution available on the premises, and it was about 11% of what Merrick wanted and roughly what he'd earned. And to his credit, he took it and didn't reach for more. He said, Booth 7 is yours as long as this building is standing. And Mr. Alcott said, It's not mine. He set 3 conditions before he'd walk back through that door, and he set them in the parking lot, and he did it in the tone of a man who used to run a parts counter, which it turned out he had, for 31 years, at a Ford dealership in Marion. No announcement. Nobody was to stand up. And he was paying for his dinner. Merrick agreed to all 3, which meant that when the front door opened and Raymond Alcott came back into that dining room, the hardest job in the building belonged to about 60 strangers who had spent 20 minutes deciding they wanted to do something for him. They didn't. That's the part I'm proudest of, and I had nothing to do with it. A man at table 4 started to get up, and his wife put her hand on his arm and he sat back down. The teenagers by the door looked at their laps. A woman in the middle section wiped her face with a napkin and went right on cutting her chicken. 60 people looked away from a man on purpose, all at once, which is a kind of standing up if you think about it. There'd been a phone out during the salute. I'd seen it, a girl about 20 at the counter, and I'd like to tell you I handled it with grace. What I did was walk over with a coffee pot and say, "Honey, I'm going to ask you for something." She had it deleted before I finished the sentence. She showed me the empty folder. Then she cried a little, and I refilled her coffee, and she stayed another hour. Mr. Alcott sat down in booth 7. He put his hand under the lip of the table first, the way he always did, and this time he knew what he was reaching for, and he found the plate and the carving both, and he stayed like that with his arm under the table and his eyes on the window for a while. I brought the meatloaf back out, a fresh one, and I set the coffee down beside it. "There's no charge on the coffee," I said. He started to say something about that. "The coffee's mine," I said. "It's not the restaurant's. I've been pouring you coffee for 11 years and I never once asked you a single question, so you're going to let me buy the coffee." He looked up at me and he said, "You're the one who got down on the floor." "Yes." "Then it's the first question anybody's asked in 54 years that had an answer under it." He picked up the cup. "Fine. The coffee's yours." Wendell came over about 10 minutes later and stood at the end of the table until he was asked to sit, and then he sat. Just him. The other 11 stayed at table 12, and they turned their chairs a little, the way men do when they want to see something without watching it, and they ate their food and kept their voices down and did not come over, because that was still the rule, and nobody had told them the rule had changed. Around 8:30, Wendell went and got Perry, and then there were 3. They didn't make a night of it. There were no speeches, and nobody said Tommy's name more than 4 or 5 times all evening, and twice they laughed at something I didn't hear. At one point, Mr. Alcott took the note out and put it on the table between them, and Wendell looked at his brother's handwriting for the first time in 58 years and had to go stand in the vestibule for a minute. At 9:40 they left. Mr. Alcott paid in cash, exact, folded in advance, and he tipped what he always tipped, which was $8, and had been a generous tip at some point a long time ago. At the door, he stopped and put his hat on. "First Friday," he said to me. "It's held," I said. "Here's what happened after, because that matters more than the salute does." Somebody wrote to Brightline. A customer, not one of us. 2 weeks later, a regional vice president drove up from Columbus with a folder, and she was genuinely moved, and she wanted to put a small brass plaque on top of the table, and a card in the menus, and a photograph on the website with the farm. Dale Merrick told her no. I was standing right there and I watched him do it in a harvest linen entryway to a woman who signs off on his numbers, and what he said was, "It's under the table on purpose, ma'am." She pushed. He said no again. She asked what the harm was and he said he'd stop coming. That cost him. I don't know exactly what it cost him because he'd never tell me. But the September visit from the company was a longer one than it needed to be, and he stopped carrying the card around in March. He didn't fire me. He put me back to floor lead in April with the raise attached, and when he did it, he didn't make a speech about it either, which I appreciated more than the money, and I only kind of mean that. My son heard about it at school, before he heard about it from me, which is how Ashfield works. He came into the kitchen at 11 at night and said, "Is it true 12 guys saluted a guy at your work?" I said it was. He said, "That's crazy," and opened the refrigerator, and I let him get most of the way through a sandwich before I told him the rest of it, and he stood there with the plate in his hand and didn't sit down for it, and at the end he said, "So the mom hid it on purpose." 16 years old, and that's the part he went to. Not the salute. There's a new line in the black book now. It's in the front, not taped in the back, and it's in his handwriting, and it reads, "First Friday of March. Booth 7. 6 o'clock. Held. Do not seat. Ask Dana." Ashfield lost 12 boys in that war, and one of them was a 19-year-old with a pocket knife who ruined the edge of a table in this building on a Friday night in March of 1967 and made his friend sign a piece of paper about it. There is nothing in this town with his name on it in letters bigger than my thumb. I've thought a lot about why that plate is under the table instead of on top of it, and I've landed somewhere I didn't expect. It isn't modesty, and it isn't shame. His mother put it where a man's hand goes. She wasn't building a monument. She was leaving a message for one specific person, in the one place he'd touch every year, and then she waited 54 years for him to find it, and she died without knowing whether he ever would. That's the loudest thing I've ever seen anybody do, and she did it with a screwdriver, in the dark, under a table. The first Friday of this coming March falls on the 6th. Table 12 is spoken for, and this year it won't hold everybody, because word got around the county, and there are 19 of them now. Wendell says the extras can stand. Mr. Alcott has been in twice since. Once in March, the way you'd expect, and once in the middle of September, on a Tuesday, by himself. And he sat in booth 7 and had coffee and no food and didn't explain it to anybody. I didn't ask him about that one either. Some questions you get to have answered and some you just get to carry, and after 11 years I have finally learned the difference. If this story sat somewhere in your chest tonight, do the thing it's asking. Find out why the old man at the end of your street does the strange thing he does every year, while he's still around to tell you. Ask him this week. And at close, after the lights are down and the chairs are up, I go over to booth 7 with a screwdriver from the drawer by the register, and I get down on the tile, and I check the 4 screws. They're always tight. I check them anyway.